For the introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. Apologies for we have to do this in English. I'll try to talk very, very slowly and clearly. Giovanni asked me to talk to you about what is going on inside the European Union and also what's going on globally in terms of the main foreign policy issues that today challenge the European Union. So I'm going to give you a general overview both of the EU's domestic challenges and its international challenges. I think one of the very interesting set of debates relates to the way that these internal challenges and our global challenges today are really two parts of a single crisis. The situation is so difficult at the moment because in the EU we are simultaneously facing a set of internal challenges, but also some very difficult challenges going on to the global order. As Giovanni mentioned, I'm partly an academic, so I will try to give you a flavour of some of the main academic debates, but my main job is in a think tank in Brussels, in which we engage with quite policy-oriented debates. So mainly what I want to leave you with is an idea of the main policy debates going on at the moment in Brussels, both to do with the general reform of the European Union, the EU's future, what the EU will look like in the future, but also the main global challenges, the main foreign policy challenges that are forcing European governments to think about their international role at the same time. So, I'll try not to talk too long so we have plenty of time for questions and comments. I'll start by running through what I think is the situation now facing us in terms of the EU's internal situation and this crucial question of whether we are heading towards a fundamental reform of the European Union. The EU, as you all know, has been through a very serious crisis over the last decade. Things at the moment do not look too bad. If we had been meeting for this conversation a couple of years ago, we would have all been very worried that the EU was on the point of collapse, that the EU may cease even to exist. Today that is not a worry. The EU has come out of the worst moments of its crisis. There is a feeling of optimism in many of the institutions in Brussels, and once again there are quite ambitious proposals on the agenda for taking cooperation forward between governments, at least in some areas of policy. So the EU has survived its crisis. The economic crisis, the crisis over migration and populism, as you all know, it's a whole range of crises that really shook the EU to its roots over the last decade. Today the situation is much better. However, while I think the EU has survived the deepest moments of crisis, the general agreement is it has not reformed itself sufficiently to prevent the next series of crises happening. It has not yet got to the roots of what has been driving the EU's difficulties over the last 7 or 8 years. Today the EU in essence still looks more or less the same kind of political body as it did 10 years ago. So you will all remember that in the worst moments of the crisis, when it looked as if the whole euro, the whole institutional edifice of the EU might collapse, our leaders were lining up to say to us that the EU had to change. The EU had to fundamentally reform. It had to reconnect with its citizens if these kinds of really profound crises were to be prevented in the future. They promised us that after the crisis there could be no return to business as usual. In fact, that is what the EU is doing. Today we are out of the worst moments of crises. There are ideas for relatively modest degrees of change in European policies, but there appears to be no imminent prospect of a really fundamental change to the EU's basic model of integration. The EU is setting itself up for a supposedly very important summit in March next year, at which the EU is supposed to be relaunching the whole project of European integration. But you all know in practice, European governments still disagree on some fairly fundamental issues. There doesn't appear to be any consensus on the main thing the EU needs to do to reform itself to prevent crises happening again. In fact, my argument would be, today, paradoxically, we are probably further away from any far-reaching change to the way that the EU works than we were in the worst moments of the EU's crisis. Why do I say that? Because in the worst moments of the crisis, there seemed to be an agreement on the part of European governments that something really radical needed to be done if the EU was to reconnect with its citizens. Ironically, as things have improved in the EU, as economic recovery has advanced, as some of the really sharpest differences between European governments are not so prominent or damaging as they were, so the appetite or the commitment to really far-reaching change in the EU seems to have dissipated, it seems to have diminished. So the kind of ideas on the agenda at the moment, to my mind, do not really seem to promise any qualitative change to the EU's basic model of integration. And that matters to us, it matters to you, and it matters to me, because it's still not clear how the EU can reconnect with its citizens. Very interesting issue is this, that you all know there were many different elements to the EU's crisis over the last decade. There was the economic crisis, there was the social crisis, the migration crisis, the political crisis to do with populism. So many different elements of crisis, but there seemed to be one thing that united all those different policy challenges, and that was that all the polls showed that citizens, ordinary voters, felt very disempowered, they felt very disconnected from the EU. They felt unable to have any meaningful influence over the way the EU operated. And you all know this is a very long-standing debate that has existed over 20 or 30 years, that the EU itself doesn't seem to be very democratically responsive to the changing demands and interests of its citizens. But if anything, what's on the agenda now seems to take the EU even further away from any understanding of how the EU can involve its ordinary citizens in a more proactive and meaningful way. It seems to be almost a kind of paradox at work, to my mind, in here. When the EU was in the worst moments of its crisis, government's attitude was that it was just impossible to reform the European Union. Simply keeping the EU alive was a big enough challenge, and fundamentally rethinking the way the EU works simply wasn't possible. It was too challenging. In a way, as things have got better, European governments have concluded that maybe we don't need to look at the EU fundamentally changing. Maybe we can go back to business as usual. Maybe a few modest tweaks or adjustments to the EU will be enough to keep the EU alive. That's where I think we are now. To my mind, the EU is not today on the brink of any kind of dramatic collapse or crisis as perhaps it was 2 years ago. But the underlying frustrations that citizens seem to feel with the European Union across Europe have not been adequately dealt with. And I will explain to you what I think would be needed for those underlying structural problems to be dealt with. At the moment in Brussels there are two issues that are being debated as potential ways of dealing with these underlying problems. One is the European elections. There's a lot of focus on the upcoming European elections in spring of next year. I think you will all know that these are beginning to attract a lot more attention than European Parliament elections have attracted previously. So there is an expectation today that these elections may politicize European debates, and they may begin to create some kind of European public sphere. They may begin to link us together as citizens across national borders to a far greater extent than any previous European Parliament elections have done. This is important and it's necessary. It's important for us to create some kind of common European political sphere so that we understand that what happens in Italy affects what's happening in Spain, what happens in Spain affects what's happening in Germany, and so on all across the European Union. The problem is, to my mind, the way that the debates are shaping up in these elections will not be enough to bring radically new ideas to the table. So I do not think that even if these parliamentary elections are more high profile, even if they get us as citizens much more involved than has been the case in previous years, I don't think these elections themselves will make a big contribution towards re-legitimizing the European Union in the eyes of ordinary voters. They are shaping up to be a big kind of fundamental existential competition between the pro-Europeans and the anti-Europeans. You all here know this much better than I do. It will be Salvini against Macron. Yes, I mean the forces of populist nativism on the one hand, versus, almost as a kind of very kind of fierce football match, together with a new alliance that is beginning to form, made up of pro-European centrist forces, potentially led by President Macron in France. This is fine to some extent. It will sharpen the debate. It will get citizens more involved. But to my mind, it's quite a risky situation. It's quite a risky situation to pose this debate in these very binary terms, pro-Europeans against anti-Europeans. To my mind, this simplifies what is actually a much more complicated set of alliances and concerns evident today across Europe. And of course, if the debate in the elections is presented in these terms, pro-Europeans against anti-Europeans, the question arises of what happens if the pro-Europeans lose those elections or do not perform as well as they might expect to do. So that's one area of very important debate that you all need to be aware of, and the fact that the elections coming up next year could, for all of you, especially as kind of young people setting the terms of the debate for the future, could, according to many people, represent a very important watershed, a moment of quite significant change in the European debate. But to my mind, there is still quite serious doubt that they will actually encourage a nuanced enough debate about the kinds of changes that are needed to the European Union in the future. So, too binary a debate, I think, is taking place between pro and anti-Europeans. The second thing that's happening that you should be aware of, and one of the supposedly big new ideas for the EU to reconnect with people like you, I mean young people, is a series of what's called citizens' consultations. Has anybody heard of these? Well, therein lies the problem. Okay, there is a process now underway all across Europe designed to offer people like you, ordinary citizens, young people, the opportunity to influence the future of the European Union. Again, this was one of Macron's big ideas when he was elected. He promised a series of democratic conventions across the whole of the European Union so that the future agenda of the EU was set by people like you. Not bureaucrats, not professional political parties, but people like you. And there is this process now underway. But it has been very low profile. Hence, it doesn't surprise me that very few people here would have heard of these consultations. And they have been very, very kind of carefully managed by the European institutions, rather than offering a kind of radical set of new alternatives to be fed into the European system by ordinary citizens. We can go into more detail about these consultations in the debate, but the basic point here is that after the crisis, leaders did recognize that something needed to be done to get ordinary citizens involved and feeling that they had some way of influencing the EU agenda. You all know that the EU is traditionally criticized for being very opaque, lacking in transparency, and very difficult for ordinary citizens to influence. So something is changing, but as yet, these kinds of initiatives that are in operation are not nearly significant enough or large-scale enough or open enough really to fundamentally to change the EU's political process. The big challenge is for the EU not to reform one area of policy or another area of policy, to have simply a little bit more economic cooperation or a bit more cooperation in migration. It's to find a fundamentally different political process through which the key decisions are made. And these kinds of things that are dominating the debate amongst many institutions at the moment in Brussels only go a very modest part of the way to changing this kind of underlying political process. What would be my solution? My solution would be for us to have a much more participative European Union. This participation needs to start at a local level, it needs to feed into national level political forums and then into regional and European level forums. Citizens need to have the ability to set the European agenda. The problem at the moment is there are many of these consultations in operation, but the agenda is genuinely set by the EU institutions. And you will be asked whether or not you agree with the EU's proposals or not, but without much possibility to be very proactive in suggesting fundamentally new ideas. I actually wrote a book last year where I kind of mapped this out in some detail and proposed what I called a compact for European citizens, and suggested that the EU needed fundamentally to change its basic rationale, the reason why it exists. You all know that after the war, for decades and decades, the EU's basic rationale was to establish peace between nations. It was a project about reconciliation between different nation states. It seems to me that in the future, the EU needs to be much more about democracy amongst its citizens. The old narrative of the EU being necessary to cement peace between governments is no longer sufficient. The EU needs to find a way of building a more transnational democracy amongst its individual citizens. This is difficult to do. It will be a long journey, and quite ambitious modes of reform will be needed. The cynic would say this is all far too idealistic and it would be impossible to realize this in practice. But something significant has been changing in recent years across the European Union as a result of the crisis. And that is that the nature of civic engagement, of civil society, has changed. Ordinary citizens are becoming engaged in a different type of politics. You all know about the protests that erupted as a result of the Eurozone crisis. So we see lots of new interesting initiatives through which individual citizens are getting involved in day-to-day politics, outside the scope of formal institutions or traditional political parties. It's often said that your generation is very apathetic about politics, but many young people are engaging in politics, but through different kinds of vehicles and paths than the traditional types of politics. So there is something happening, and it's positive and it's dynamic and it's exciting. The European civic sphere, as we might call it, is not the same as it was 10 years ago. But this is all happening in a way that is very disconnected from debates happening at the EU level. And so the big challenge, will be the challenge for your generation in the future, is to try and link together these new forms of civic engagement with debates at the European level, debates about the future of the European Union. It seems to me that that is really the big challenge if the EU is to come out of its crisis in a really sustainable way. Okay. That would be my proposal. You can all come back and criticise me or agree. We can go into that in detail in the discussion. To finish off, one very important point arises from the way I have described this crisis to you. And that is, it seems to me that saving the European Union is not about defeating the populists. is not about defeating the populists. And this is important because this is the way the debate is becoming framed in many countries and in many EU institutions in Brussels today. If only we can find a way for a kind of status quo parties to group together and put the populist forces across Europe on the back foot, the anti-European populist forces, then the EU will return to a much healthier situation. It seems to me this is much too vague approach. There are huge differences between the parties we describe as populists, and it seems to me the real challenge is to understand the underlying causes behind the rise, the surge in these populist parties. And it's that the EU really needs to do. And to do that, again, it comes back to the need for a much more open and participative political process. It cannot be about simply tweaking one policy area or another, or the so-called mainstream pro-European parties colluding together to defeat the populists. So to my mind, that's a very, very important issue, especially given developments in Italy in terms of the way that we frame the future of European Union debate. And then final point on the internal challenges. If we understand the EU's predicament in these terms of citizens needing a greater say over the future direction of the EU, this has another, to my mind, very important implication, and that is that the EU in the future will have to be much more flexible. If the EU is to be able to respond to citizens' interests and demands, these different interests and demands are incredibly varied today across different European countries. What is needed to re-legitimize the EU in the eyes of Italian citizens may be the very opposite of what is needed to re-legitimize the EU in the eyes of a Dutch or Finnish voter. Therefore, it seems to me that it is very, very difficult to imagine any one uniform institutional template in the future that can satisfy all these different perspectives that have risen to the surface between different European citizens. And therefore the EU has to find a way of being much more flexible in the future. And this is something else that again is on the agenda, But I think what would be dangerous for the EU to do would be to move towards a two-speed model. Again, this is something that is being debated. As leaders become frustrated with populist parties holding up progress, the temptation is to think in terms of creating a kind of inner circle or an inner core of states that will proceed to a much deeper form of integration, and an outer core of states that would participate in a far more diluted degree of European cooperation. So this is something that is in the air and being debated. To my mind, it would be harmful. It would risk recreating this very sharp kinds of divisions in Europe between those states on the inside and those not fully involved in European cooperation, that could then engender even more tensions that would be even more difficult to manage over the longer term. So again, we can go into this in greater detail, but it seems to me that the EU will need to be more flexible and agile in the future. But that form of flexibility should not take the form of a two-speed Europe that creates a fundamental single new dividing line across the European continent. So governments will have to think about different ways of injecting some kind of agility and flexibility into the European Union without dividing the European continent into these two blocks. Okay, so final comment there. These are all the kind of issues that are in the air in the lead up to this summit in 2019 that is supposed to mark a fundamental new beginning to the European Union. But as I've explained to you, it's not clear that governments so far are anywhere near agreeing on the kind of underlying changes that I think would be necessary to take the EU fully beyond its last decade of crisis. So that's my basic argument in terms of the EU's internal challenges. Do you want me to stop here and take questions, or shall I just go on and do the foreign policy?
It's up to you.
Before I move on to the foreign policy sphere, does anybody want to ask me questions on just on the internal situation? Then we'll talk about the big kind of global challenges.
I have a question. What do you think about the relationship?
Wait a second.
Well, hello, thank you for your presentation. I'm Matias from Argentina, and I want to know what do you think about the relationship between the media and the democracy, and how the media can influence and can impose a way to think and a way to this democracy, a way to impose a democracy specific by the media.
Okay, this is a huge topic that has many different elements to it. The EU is being accused of being rather slow off the mark in terms of understanding the way that digital technology is being utilized by some of the big media companies to distort the way democracy is working. Now, another very lively area of debate in Brussels is about the measures that the EU needs to take to ensure that the big media companies, the big digital companies, function according to certain regulations that prevents them from distorting good quality democratic process. So things are moving forward on this. It is recognized that the media are being controlled and distorted today in ways that make the kinds of healthy democratic debate that I've been talking to you about more and more difficult. However, having said that, I think we need to avoid being too negative about the current situation. I mean, many of you here will probably know that when digital technology started first appearing, the assumption was that it was an unqualified good for democracy, that it would allow you and I as individual citizens to hold power to account. In fact, one of the very most famous digital democracy apps arose precisely in Argentina as a bit, and made a major contribution to the idea that through digital apps, we as citizens would have much stronger ability to hold our representatives to account. Then the pendulum swung in a much more negative direction, where it seemed that through the big tech giants, our individual preferences were being distorted, particularly by more extreme opinion and extreme voices, and that this was one of the reasons why the European project itself was being undercut by more anti-European, nativist, populist, illiberal voices. That is certainly the case, but we shouldn't I don't think we should, it's too easy simply to put the blame for all the EU's problems on the misuse of information by certain media companies. They are part of the problem, but reforming media would not be an easy panacea. There are far more fundamental issues at stake or problematic in the European Union. So that's one caveat I would add. And the other caveat is that digital technology, online media, citizen journalism still holds a lot of positive potential for enlivening democratic debate if it is used in the right way. So it seems to me that we shouldn't go too far in the negative direction of thinking that all these online apps today need to be rigorously controlled. Fake news is a big problem, but we don't need the EU to operate as a kind of ministry of truth, dictating what is true and what is not. We need more open debate. A lot of that will be done through digital technology, but the big challenge is to make sure that the online media in particular function in a way that enhances the kind of mainstream offline political activity that is needed to underpin a different kind of European Union.
Thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed your view about how populism is conceived, because it doesn't work. Because
can you introduce yourself?
Andrea. I'm Andrea.
Andrea, from Italy.
Andrea, from Italy, from Sicily. I wanted to ask, even if legitimacy is the real problem, and legitimacy is a symbolic resource, is something that has to do with identity. The fact that we are ostracizing, I don't know if I can say, we are putting the blame on the populist. It arrives to us that populists are outside the political sphere. So populists are antagonists, our really enemy, and this means that they are not. Democracy is not working, because democracy is a way to make, to insert every opinion inside the political sphere. So if we put some opinion outside, and this has been done for so much time, we will just lose these people to the legitimacy of the whole system. So I thank you for this, because not so many people does this reflection. But my question was, how can we make more participative the European Union if the political society inside states has now arrived to this divide, this like amicus inimicus, like Schmittian divides between people. I don't think that social movement alone could have a link and really roots.
It's a fair question, and I do. I would actually invite you to buy the book I wrote last year. It's a very, very cheap book, so but it actually addresses this very question that you're posing. It's a very good question, because many people would be very critical of what I'm proposing to you, and they would say, but this is the most foolish kind of suggestion you can imagine at the moment. Just when we have this surge of populist opinion, the last thing we want to do is to give people, ordinary citizens, more of a say over the European Union. So leaders will tend to say, in theory, the EU needs to reconnect with its citizens. People like yourselves need to have more of a say in the future of the EU. But just at the moment, it would be dangerous to let the people have more of a say, because if there were more democracy at the moment, we may not like the result of it. Yeah, the result may be slightly more critical views would have more sway over the European Union. So the temptation is to kind of set aside the need to introduce more democracy. And this is the kind of way Macron thinks in particular. Let us complete the European project first, and then we bring in the people. The kind of ideas I'm giving to you are far too idealistic at the moment, when we just need, the phrase used by leaders in Brussels would be, let's just focus on a Europe that delivers. It gives your citizens concrete things, it delivers tangible benefits. Let's not be too ambitious about fundamentally reforming the EU. The last thing we need at the moment is for ordinary citizens to come in and push the EU in unpredictable directions. So I think it's a bit like the old Catholic thing, no, of saying, Lord, God made me virtuous, but not quite yet. And this is the same kind of line with democracy. Eventually, the EU has to function as a more democratic system. But at the moment, there are far more urgent challenges that need to be dealt with first. To some extent, I can appreciate that kind of reasoning. Giving more sway to civic movements, social movements, ordinary citizens will not be a magic solution. Will not be a magic solution. and it may produce certain results that for a pro-European may be rather uncomfortable. But it seems to me the problem with the EU is that it has been promising this democratization for many, many years. These are not new issues. These are not new issues. Governments were promising to reconnect the EU with its voters 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I mean, you will all be too young to remember, but even as far back as the Maastricht Treaty and other crucial turning points in EU history, elites had recognised and acknowledged that they had got a bit ahead of public opinion and that the EU needed to find a way of engaging its ordinary citizens. So everyone agrees that this is needed, and it's the kind of default option in many European debates. The problem is nothing is ever done in concrete terms to actually change the equation, to give you the ability to hold the EU to account in more meaningful ways. Why? Because it doesn't seem to be a very tangible priority. When leaders are sitting there trying to save the euro, when the euro is on the brink of collapse, when Greece or Italy need emergency economic assistance, then it's obvious that is going to be their focus. When they need to agree something, some kind of measure to deal with the influx of 1.5 million refugees, that becomes the priority. These kind of issues that I'm talking to you about, democratizing the whole political system in Europe, don't seem to be very concrete. They don't seem to be very tangible. They're not the kinds of issues that leaders talk about when they sit down to have dinner together at summits. They talk about other things, the economic situation, about Brexit, about the migration situation. And this means that the need to introduce more democracy and more participation into the EU is constantly put off. It never seems to be the moment for bringing to the table radically new ideas that would actually open up the EU to more popular participation. And this has been going on for 20 or 30 years. So my kind of counter-argument would be, fine, democratizing the EU is not going to be an easy solution, but how can we have solutions to the EU's crises in the future that do not take into account citizens' opinions, what citizens want of the EU, and to give them some kind of ability to set the agenda? It seems to me that the old model of our elites basically deciding what is good for us as European citizens is gone. That time, that generation is gone. And in the future there has to be a much more participative process. And if we keep on delaying that, kind of change, then the next time we have a crisis, and there will be a next crisis, then the EU will struggle even more to deal with that crisis. Why? Because the pool of legitimacy that the EU is able to draw on from its citizens will be less and less in each subsequent crisis. And therefore, coming out of each crisis will become progressively more difficult.
Good afternoon, I'm Walter from Italy, and I'd like to ask which kind of mechanisms could be developed and applied to ensure the flexibility of EU responsiveness, which to me seems a rather too vague concept.
Again, you can buy the book, and there's a kind of detailed suggestions there. Part of it is again about this dimension of democracy. So far, when the EU debates these flexible models of integration, they're fairly technocratic in notion. So it's a question of the EU institutions deciding.
So this is the book, sorry. So that's
but again, it's not you and I deciding where there should be flexibility. It's quite a technocratic notion of saying, on policy issue X, we need full supranational cooperation. On other areas of cooperation, perhaps this is not so essential. But it's difficult to come up with an objective assessment of exactly which kind of functions need to be Europeanized and which kind of functions do not need to be Europeanized. It is subjective. And therefore it seems to me that the flavour of the EU in the future needs to be more open and flexible. And some of the things I mean by that is that at the moment the assumption is there is one single EU policy in each area, unless a government really has a good reason for opting out. It seems to me an interesting way of reversing that in the future would be that for there to be much more of a philosophy of governments to choosing to opt into policy areas rather than having to show that they have the right to opt out. Another very difficult and thorny question is the issue of whether EU policies can ever be reversed. One thing that's distinctive about the EU is that as national governments, with our national governments, we as citizens can force them to change direction. This never happens at the EU level. Once a policy is embedded legally at the EU level, we can't change direction. You know, the whole world can change, the whole political situation can change, the economic situations can change out of all recognition, but the EU policies do not change. So therefore it seems to me that there has to be some mechanism of the EU being able to more easily change direction or reverse policies in the future. And then one perhaps rather kind of far-reaching suggestion I talk about in the book is this, that today the big divisions in the EU are often not between nation states, they are within nation states. It's not just Germany against Italy or Spain against the Netherlands. The big divisions are often between, say, the big cosmopolitan cities across the EU on the one hand, that are fairly well linked together, fairly well Europeanized, and what we might call the kind of hinterlands in each country that don't feel that European integration has delivered much for them, and areas that feel very alienated from the European Union level. I mean, in the UK, you can certainly see this division at work in a very, very damaging way at the moment. So it seems to be a big question is if there is any scope at all for allowing variation, not just between different countries of the EU, but also within them as well in the future.
Yeah. Good morning. I'm Ottavia from Italy. I wanted to ask. I don't know if it's a question, actually. So when we talk about populism, we talk about it as just a voice in the democracy. Instead, I think, not me. I'm anyone. Some academics think that populism is a direct result of how European Union has conducted its politics. So, what I mean is that with the introduction of the European institutions, the states have lost their sovereignty, but the European Union never gave an actual alternative to this loss of sovereignty. So I think the actual question is if populism is a direct result of European Union, the only alternative we have is to improve, and not just improve the European Union, but to change the European Union and create an alternative to this loss of sovereignty of the states.
It's not really a question. It's a very good summary of the argument I was trying to make. So I agree fully with you. There may be people who are more expert in populism than I am, but it seems to me it's an enormously complex area of debate. And it's a puzzle to me why nearly all the political debate about what's going wrong with the EU at the moment is framed in terms of populism. It seems to me there are many challenges. Populism is one amongst many of the challenges facing European democracy today, but it's not everything. It's not everything. And there are dangers in terms of framing the debate, in terms of populism being the main challenge. Populism can be good for democracy or it can be very bad for democracy. All the parties that experts or politicians refer to as populist, in fact, can be very different from each other. They can be very, very different from each other. There's a long-standing debate about what really causes populism. There's no easy answer. Populism has emerged in some European countries that have done very well economically, so it's clearly not a direct result of economic crisis. In other countries, it's clearly being driven by cultural fears, concerns over identity. In other countries, it's a very complex mix of economics and cultural aspects. So there's no easy answer. There's a great variation between different populist parties, and the factors driving them vary from one country to another as well. Which seems to me to be why it's a little bit simplistic to say the way of solving the populist problem is for us to push ahead, complete the European Union, and hope that that then delivers to European citizens sufficiently to deal with the kinds of problems that the populists refer to in their political manifesto. But neither can be a solution of going to the other extreme of thinking that unwinding European cooperation and integration will provide the means of dealing with the kinds of grievances that help us explain why populism has become so powerful. So it seems to me, exactly as you say, it's more about the qualitative relationship between citizens and their political institutions that really needs to be dealt with and changed if populism, if the kind of populist parties are not to be defeated, but if we are to make sure that they don't operate in a way that represents a danger to democratic norms and values across the European Union.
Yes, I'm Filippo from Italy, and I wanted to ask if it's reasonable to think in terms of the democratic deficit and divide the problem into representation and legitimacy, and say that, for example, if on the side of representation there's the problem of allowing too many people to take part into the politics, so too much democracy would maybe be harmful for the European Union. Is there a way to increase legitimacy and not representation, for example? So not allowing the people to take part directly, but for example by giving benefits, like clear, tangible benefits of what the European Union does, then allow a higher level of legitimacy from the people. And so this is a question if we can kind of divide these two spheres. And the second is, what is the view on the idea of enforcement, like if the possibility of enforcing laws would allow the European Union to be more effective in its policies, and if then increasing the legitimacy would allow the possibility of enforcement, and if this would kind of have any positive or negative effects. What is the view on this topic?
Okay, so 3 or 4 really important issues that roll together in that question. You've all covered this, the debate about the democratic deficit, yes, in your various courses. You know what this is, basically. You know, the notion here is that as the EU has progressed, national governments have transferred powers to the European level, so we lose democratic accountability at the national level. And yet there are then not new means of accountability at the European level. So we lose the overall degree of democratic accountability. And that got worse in the Eurozone crisis. Why? Because governments agreed certain new measures to defend the Eurozone crisis from the economic situation, and they succeeded in doing that. But the democratic implications of that were not very positive. I mean, the main actor in defending the Eurozone against the crisis was the European Central Bank, that doesn't have a particularly democratic mandate, and the way it operated was successful in dealing with the crisis, but it actually undercut democratic accountability to a much greater extent. So, I mean, you all know this for the European semester, that European governments today have to present their budgets to European institutions to get them validated at the European Union level before they go through national parliaments. From a democratic point of view, that's uncomfortable. That's uncomfortable. So that's the democratic deficit. My argument is that, as I think you imply, the EU's democracy problem today is not just about that democratic deficit. It's not just about the limits of democratic accountability in the EU institutions. Why? Because we are suffering democracy problems not just at the EU level, but at the national level as well. So the democracy problem today is not just a problem of the EU institutions not being very transparent. It's the way that certain democratic rights and checks and balances are being diminished, are weakening at the national level as well. And I'm sure you all know the most serious cases we're talking about: Hungary, Poland, other countries as well, not just the Eastern European countries, but in most member states today, there have been not a dramatic attack on democratic norms, but a loss of what we might call democratic accountability. So this is very, very interesting. If you look at there's a lot of international surveys done that rank the quality of democracy around the world. I'm sure you've heard of these, Freedom House, The Economist does one, there's kind of half a dozen of these. And over the last few years, they've all found that the quality of democracy in nearly all EU member states is going down. It's control of media, it's control over civic rights, it's restrictions on civil society organizations. It's not dramatic, it's a kind of incremental deterioration in the quality of national level democracy. So if we are to revive the quality of European democracy, part of this has to be about the national level and not just the EU level. That's why I think it's not enough simply to talk about the European Parliament and giving the European Parliament more powers, or national parliaments more power over what happens at the European Union level. These are very traditional kinds of solutions that are always put on the table. They may be part of the equation, but they will not be enough. They will not be enough because the quality of democracy at the national level also needs to be rethought and also needs to be revived. The way we do that relates to the second point about the relationship between representative and participative democracy. So I don't know how many of you have done kind of basic democratic theory as part of your courses, but there's been a long-running debate about what produces the best kind of democracy. Is it representative democracy, or is it more direct forms of democracy that gives individual citizens more direct influence over decisions? The general view, the general argument is, in the future we need to find ways of combining representative democracy with more direct or more participative forms of democracy. What I'm suggesting to you is not about completely replacing formal avenues of representative democracy. It's about complementing them, those kinds of avenues, with more direct forms of accountability and participation. It's not about referendum. It's not about referendums being used regularly. You all know, and you would have suffered the consequences here, the way that referendums have been used in recent years by politicians in quite disingenuous ways, and that's given direct democracy a rather bad name. But there are ways of increasing more direct participative forms of democracy that can be more positive, less harmful than Brexit, for example. And it doesn't mean that with those the fact that referendums may have gone the wrong way in Italy, in the UK, in other European countries as well, doesn't, to my mind, undermine the case for finding more direct ways of having citizens engage in democratic politics, not to circumvent representative institutions, but to get representative democracy and more direct forms of democracy working together in tandem. It seems to me that really is the challenge we need to address in the future. And finally, you mentioned the issue of enforcement. I think if I understood you correctly, This comes back to a very old debate in the EU about something called output legitimacy. Have you all heard of this phrase? So the argument of many in the EU was always that the important thing was for the EU to deliver to its citizens. The EU wasn't very democratic. It would probably never be very democratic. But at least as long as it continued to deliver concrete benefits to us as citizens, then what we shouldn't worry very much about that lack of democratic accountability. Some people argue that this is the most important thing, that if the EU can enforce policy improvements and deliver, if it can improve the economic situation, some people would argue, if the EU can improve the economic situation in Europe, get us beyond the economic crisis, then we shouldn't really worry about these issues of democratic quality that I'm talking about. And many leaders are still tempted or seduced by this way of arguing. So this is the kind of reason why they argue we just need an EU that delivers, an EU of practical results. Let's just make sure the EU does concrete things. It delivers training for jobless young people. It stabilizes the economic situation. It provides some kind of more efficient border control between the EU and the external world. Let's get these very practical things sorted out and not worry too much about what people would call input legitimacy, democratic legitimacy. As I have explained to you, it seems to me that was always the way that elites thought, and in a way it's what has produced the kind of situation, the kind of crisis and frustration that we are seeing today. So from my mind, it is not sufficient as a way forward for the European Union.
Okay. I am Xavier from Italy, and I wanted to jump back to a sentence that you said. What's happening? Okay. I wanted to jump back to a sentence that you said, and it's the EU has to change and reconnect with the citizens. And I have to make a premise, because I know that right now, because of the sovereignty of the member states, of course, citizenship is not like competence of the EU. But I think that this is the main problem, because right now we have a different access to citizenship. And so when we say like citizen consultations, or that we have to reconnect with the citizens, we need to talk first about who these citizens are. And so the problem right now is, for example, that we have a child that if he is born like in France or in Germany, in France this kid can be citizen in like 6 years of schooling. In Germany he can be a citizen with 8 years of residence, but right now, for example, in Italy you have to wait 18 years to be a citizen, and right now with Salvini things are only getting worse. So the problem right now and here is that we have to make sure that every citizen is recognized as such, and for people coming from outside, we have to grant people the same access to citizenship. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Because we also have freedom of movement, we also have like a lot of things that are connected with this, but actually we don't have one single Euro citizenship right now, because we have different accesses. And so we have first to grant equal access in the whole Europe, and by this means we can create like a meaningful European citizenship, because I think that Europe somehow should be able to compensate what the member states cannot. And I mean, this problem is like proof, it's evidence that this shouldn't be a prerogative of the member states. This should be like on a European level, because otherwise it doesn't work.
I wouldn't disagree with that, but it seems to me it will be quite difficult in the future for there to be... I agree those differences need to be reduced or eliminated, preferably. But there have been over many years attempts to create a common European citizenship, and it's been very, very difficult to do that. I mean, there are certain common rights, as you know, but not a kind of full concept, a full uniform concept of citizenship. And a lot of the debates today, and I'm sure you all feel that here, is much more back to the notion of national identity. It seems to me the debate a lot of the very important debates and difficult debates in the future will be about how we recognize that how governments can create some kind of form of national identity that gives citizens a feeling that they belong, that they have community, that kind of community is not threatened by European cooperation, but to do that in a way that doesn't undermine the prospects for European cooperation. It seems to me that what we're talking about here in terms of political reform to the European Union will have to be a kind of mix of different levels of identity and different levels of political accountability. What it seems to me is very difficult to imagine in the future that we can take the model of the nation state and simply replicate that at the European level and have a kind of European nation or a European state framework that is simply the equivalent of the nation state but at the European level. It seems to me that if the reality today speaks against that kind of option in the future. It seems to me that national identity has to be part of the equation in the future. People will need to feel some kind of stronger roots in national identity, or maybe local, regional identities as well. But a form of national identity that doesn't damage the prospects for European cooperation. That will be a very, very complex and difficult debate, and there'll be a very kind of thin line between a national form of identity that is perfectly positive and legitimate and healthy on the one hand, and a form of nationalism that goes further than that and starts making cooperation at the European level, harmony at the European level, a lot more difficult to achieve. It seems to me that these are the kind of debates that we will be confronting in the future. How do we? Because if you look at all the polls, this is what a lot of citizens across many European countries feel, that power has been taken too far away from them. They feel distanced from power, and they want power brought back to them. Some of you may have seen some of the recent Eurobarometer polls, which show that across nearly all member states, European citizens, people your generation, are very pro-European. Nobody wants to repeat the turmoil that the UK is going through. But at the same time, a majority of people also want to see some power brought back from the European level to a more national or a more local level, where they feel they have more meaningful influence over decisions. So it will be very, very difficult. But this is really where the challenge is. How do we, what kind of balance, what kind of trade-off do we want in the future between the benefits of scale, cooperation to manage interdependence on the one hand, and the benefits of having decisions much more locally rooted, where we're able to identify with local community and have more meaningful influence over our decisions. And there will need to be some kind of trade-off if the EU is to work effectively in the future.
I'm Simone from Italy, and I want to ask you your opinion about the ruled out possibility to transform the British seats at the European Parliament in transnational pan-European seats, and your opinion that would have been a good way to strengthen the European democracy or not. Thank you.
So do you all know the situation in the Parliament at the minute? The fact that the UK seats will be left vacant. There's about 72 or 73 of the seats. There have been lots of proposals about what to do with these seats. And one proposal was to introduced a new concept of transnational party lists, so that an Italian could stand for an election in Germany or the Netherlands in the future. So there would be more kind of connection between different national level debates. So it seemed to me that was a perfectly sensible idea. It wouldn't mean the whole of the parliament would become transnational, just a portion of the seats. The parties in the European Parliament rejected this suggestion. Why? Because they rather feel that this would lead to them losing control over their own national political spheres. So rather ironic that even though they espouse certain European norms, they still function and organise and think on more of a national level. To my mind, the more interesting proposal would have been not to give these 70-odd seats to party representatives from transnational lists, but rather to give them to ordinary citizens. I mean, there have been many proposals over the years for for a citizens' assembly, the European Parliament to have a second chamber made up of ordinary citizens chosen by random. Do you all know the term sortition? You heard of sortition? No? It's the method that the Greeks used in Athenian democracy, where there weren't professional politicians, but you could be chosen by random as an ordinary citizen to go and participate in the decision-making forum. So some people have suggested that maybe this would be a way of bringing ordinary citizens into the European Parliament and tightening the connection between the EU and ordinary citizens. And it seems to me this could have been, again, this will not solve the whole of all the problems facing the EU, but it might be an interesting, modest addition to the current citizens' initiatives that exist. So one could have imagined a situation where citizens from across the EU could have been chosen by lot, by random, to fill the seats being vacated by the British MEPs, which would have brought some so-called ordinary citizens into the European Parliament. That's the option that I would have preferred for these newly empty seats. At the moment, that's not going to happen. The parties have chosen a very traditional way forward, which is that they will share out these empty seats between themselves. So they've seen it as an opportunity not to think of new ideas, not to bring some fresh blood into the European Parliament, but simply to increase their own number of seats in the Parliament. And it seems to me that's exactly what we don't need, the wrong way to go in terms of thinking about the future of EU reform. Should perhaps just take a couple of questions on the internal issues, and if you want I can talk a bit about, are you interested in the foreign policy dimension? Yes? Do you want me to shift on to that? No fun? Okay, alright, well let's do that. So I have to be quite brief, right? Okay. Alright, the first issue here is that you have to understand something very, very crucial to my mind, is that when we've been talking about the EU's crisis over the last decade as an economic crisis, it's a crisis about populism or about migration, it's not just an internal crisis. It's an internal crisis that is also to do with the crisis in the way that the EU relates to the rest of the world. So there is no longer, it seems to me, a set of hermetically sealed internal challenges, but rather there is much more interconnection and interlinkage between the EU's global challenges and its internal challenges. Why? Because it's what I've called here this kind of domestic global illiberalism. We've talked about the populists and the challenges to liberal norms within the European Union, but we all know there are big challenges to liberal norms internationally as well. So the international order, what is referred to as the liberal international order, is under threat. You've all covered this, right, in other courses? You all know what the basic situation in the world order is, what they've done? Yes? Okay, so there is general agreement that the basic norms of the liberal international order today are being threatened. The concept of cooperative security, of objective rules governing international relations, the importance of human rights concerns in international relations, these all form part of the international order that has existed since the end of the Second World War. it's generally agreed that that system today is under threat. It's most obviously under threat from illiberal regimes like Russia and China, from many other Asian regimes as well, who do not buy into the concept of rule-based order, at least in many spheres. They do not buy into the concept that liberal political values like democracy and human rights should be part of the international architecture. And perhaps most worryingly for us, today the threats seem to be coming not just from China or Russia, from non-Western rising powers, but from the United States itself. And as you all know, the liberal international order has only existed over the last 30, 40 years because of the United States, because the United States has been the hegemonic power that has sponsored and underpinned this international order. Whether that order ever functioned in a way that was quite as liberal as its proponents suggested was the case is another debate. But it is generally recognized that this international order is in big trouble. And this, of course, raises a crucial question for the EU. Again, the challenges for the EU are not simply about one policy area or another. It's not simply about managing Russia, managing China, or managing the challenges that come from the Middle East. It's about what kind of international order does the EU aspire to in the future, as other powers around the world begin to question the fundamental tenets of international order. What is the best way for the EU to respond? Do we defend our interests, our key strategic interests, by increasing our support for the liberal international order? Or is it best for the EU itself to recognise that we need to become more realist? We need to become a little bit more geopolitical and realpolitik in the future if we want to defend our interests. That in the future, these nice liberal norms at the international level can no longer be relied upon to defend our core strategic interests. And therefore, we as the European Union, as European governments, need to think about a different way of working in international relations.
Second of the party.
Yes. So this is a key issue for the European Union. What's changed over the last year is this: that as the United States has stepped back from being the lead supporter of the international liberal order, many voices in the European Union suggest that the EU needs to step forward and demonstrate that it can be the main defender of the global liberal order. And so I think as you will all appreciate, the big expectation falls in particular on the shoulders of the German government. For the last 50 years, Germany has punched below its weight in international relations for obvious historic reasons. There is much more pressure on Germany today to step up and be the leading liberal power in international relations, at least during the period in which it seems that the United States president represents more of a danger to liberal order than a protector of that international order. So it seems to me that this is just a serious systemic level challenge that is facing the European Union as any of the internal challenges we've been talking about so far. How is the EU responding to this challenge? My answer is it's responding in a rather messy and incoherent way. And this is not entirely the EU's fault. It's because the way that the world is changing is so difficult, is so unpredictable, and is so challenging for what have been typically the European ways of dealing with international relations. So if you think in very rather simplistic terms, rather simplified terms, of there being these two options for the EU, how do we defend our interests when the international order is in danger? Do we put more effort into defending that international order, or do we say let's give up on the international order and find more immediate, realpolitik ways of defending our interests? And the answer is the EU is doing a bit of both of those things, because it can't quite decide what the optimal way is for it to defend its key strategic interests in the future. So you can no longer, to my mind, see any particularly coherent or uniform way that the EU is acting in international affairs. In some spheres, over the last year, it has stepped forward to try and defend global rules. In other spheres, it's trying to find a way around the norms of the global order. It's still supporting international order, multilateralism, but finding more immediate ways of protecting its own interests. And in other ways, it is beginning to act in ways that directly contradict what is supposed to be the fundamental principles of liberal order. So you have a full range of options there that the EU seems to be pursuing, depending on the kind of policy area it's dealing with at any particular moment. So to make that concrete for you, a few examples. In international trade, you all know that at the moment there is the big worry that the international trading system is falling apart because of the trade wars between the United States and China. How is the EU positioning itself vis-à-vis this new risk of trade wars, trade battles between the US and China? Well, to some extent, the EU is stepping forward and saying we need to do more to defend the global trading system. So the EU's just put forward a package of reforms for the World Trade Organization that would try to strengthen the multilateral dimension of international trade. At the same time, the EU itself is actually going round these international rules and trying to come up with its own bilateral trading deals with other powers, other economies around the world. Often on certain trading issues today, it is cooperating more with China than with the United States. So on many commercial issues, we see an alliance between the EU and China against the United States. On some issues of tariffs and quotas, the EU is cooperating with the United States against China. And the fact that China still isn't opening up the access to its market in the way that European companies and American companies think should be the case. So you can see there's a kind of mix there. The EU is still trying to defend the global trading system, but it's reached the conclusion that it can't rely upon those global rules in trading system being strong enough to protect our own economic interests in the future. So all European governments, and Italy included, is becoming a lot more geo-economic than they were in previous years. What do I mean by geo-economic? I mean the priority today is much more on reaching good commercial deals with Russia, Iran, China, Japan. The EU's just signed a trade deal with Japan, rather than the importance of international trade rules in and of themselves. So that's one area in international trade. Another very important area is in defence, hard security. This is the area where European foreign policy has probably changed most significantly over the last year. As the threats coming at Europe from around the world increase in seriousness, European governments are beginning to increase their investment in defence capabilities. During the years of the crisis, European defence expenditure decreased. For about a decade, it's very interesting, if you looked around the world, defence expenditure was increasing all around the world. Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, Brazil have been building up their armed forces. In only one region of the world was defence expenditure decreasing, and that was Europe. That trend is now being reversed. As the EU looks around its borders and sees the Ukraine conflict, Russian antagonism, let's say, or assertive diplomacy on the part of Russia, one might say, fears of international terrorism and instability in the Middle East, it seems a very much more hostile world. So the big change that the EU has introduced, pushed in particular by someone you will know well, Federica Mogherini, has been on defence. So the big commitment the EU's made over the last year is to increase its commitment to increasing defence expenditure and cooperating more efficiently across national borders within Europe to iron out duplication and expensive waste in European defence expenditure. So European defence capabilities look a lot stronger today than they did 4 or 5 years ago. The European Commission, that as you know was never involved in defence and security, is now introducing a big new fund, 500 million euros, for the development of new defensive capabilities, new weapons, new armaments. So the EU in this sense, as you all know, traditionally presented itself as a civilian power, a non-military power, is changing in nature. It is becoming much more engaged in debates about hard security, about defence. Some people would say this is a very good thing and it's overdue, and that in a much more hostile world the EU needs this kind of defensive capability in order to defend itself. But again, it's not about the liberal order. It's about Europeans defending themselves from threats rather than engaging outwards in initiatives of cooperative security. Okay, so do you appreciate the difference there? It's the EU saying we need to do more to defend ourselves in a very direct fashion today, rather than thinking we can go abroad outside the EU and transform other countries, other regions, and convince them to adopt our kind of approach to cooperative security. So that's a big change we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. The basic doubt here, and I'll finish off here, the basic doubt here in all these big foreign policy debates is this: whether the EU is still a partner to the EU in defending the liberal order, or if the US itself is today the biggest foreign policy threat to the EU, to the extent that it begins to chip away at these global rules and norms in the management of international relations. The crucial thing is that member states disagree amongst themselves on this question. There is no single European Union position on how to deal with the rather worrying developments in EU foreign policy we've seen. Whether this is a temporary situation and that in the future the EU is still likely to be the EU's main strategic partner, or if this is the moment where the EU needs to kind of de-anchor itself, de-link itself from the strategic partner with the US, and realise that in the future other partnerships, other strategic arrangements will be just as important with China, with other Asian powers, and probably even getting back to a situation where we have some workable strategic partnership with Russia. So at the moment the EU is trying to do a bit of both. It's trying to separate itself a bit from the EU. The phrase the EU uses to describe this separation is a strategic autonomy. Have you all heard this phrase being used? This is the phrase that's supposed to indicate that the EU is moving to a situation where it can protect its own security interests autonomously from the United States to a much greater degree in the future than was the case in the past. But the EU still can't quite break itself fully free from the United States, because that would require a fundamental reconfiguration of European foreign policy. Over the last 30 years, the EU has been able to function as a kind of liberal power in foreign relations because it's had that core security protection of the United States. If that goes, then the EU needs to fundamentally change the way it acts in international relations. I think I'll leave it here because I think we're short of time. I was going to talk a little bit to you about kind of concrete regional challenges in the Mediterranean and also to do with Russia and Ukraine. And I'm happy to fill people in on those more specific challenges. But if we're talking about the overarching structural challenge facing the EU's engagement in the world, it's this. it's this. It's to do with the way that the global order itself is changing and how that poses quite existential challenges to the EU's traditional way of working in foreign policy.
Okay, let's launch a second round of questions. We have 10 minutes.
Yes, I have a second question, which is, what do you exactly mean? What is it meant practically when we say that, for example, when we talk about interest in exporting let's say, democracy or stability in the international relationship system? Like, practically, what does that mean? What does that imply? Like, you mentioned the two strategies, right? So, what would it mean to safeguard international order? Would it mean to act like the US did in the last decades and take their place? So, like, yeah, I think about maybe in North Korea, it for some reason might seem a good example of keeping kind of an order in the international system. But other examples are not really. I mean, it's arguable that United States are democracy and justice, let's say, knights, or I don't know how to say. So practically, what does it mean to take the other strategy and safeguard?
Again, there's a very big area of debate. What can be done in practice to support these kind of liberal values like human rights and cooperative security around the world? There are lots of different tools. I would just mention one, and that is that the argument has always been that the EU's most powerful tool internationally is itself. The EU's most powerful global instrument of influence is its own model of integration. What do I mean by that? Traditionally, the EU has said to partners around the world, you sign up to our norms, our rules. You align your markets, your economic rules to our rules. We will help you do that. That will help the process of democratization. It will improve your performance on human rights. So you align yourself with the EU model, and then in return we will offer you access to that market. We will offer you development assistance, or all kinds of cooperation, and that is basically the main pillar of our cooperation. You all heard there's a kind of theoretical strand of thinking called Europeanization. Have you all come across this? So the thinking was that the EU's foreign policy functioned on the basis of Europeanization, trying to Europeanize other societies. That seemed to work in Eastern Europe, it seemed to work in Southern Europe in the process, in the period in which Southern European states were going through democratic transition. The trouble is that seemed to have stopped working today. That process of Europeanization is not working in the Middle East. We have the Arab Spring, but Arab countries, Mediterranean countries, didn't seem to be interested in aligning themselves with the European Union as a way of democratizing their own political systems. And there seems to be great resistance to that on the eastern borders as well. So the EU is having to go through a process of rethinking how it acts in foreign policy in a situation where its own model doesn't seem to be capable of having the same kind of transformational effects as it did in previous years. And in a way, this is pushing the EU back to a more traditional form of diplomacy. The EU's line was always that we don't do traditional forms of foreign policy or classical forms of diplomacy. That's no longer quite the case. The EU is moving back to a situation where its foreign policy looks a much more traditional form of foreign policy. It's about diplomatic engagement. It's about doing trade-offs. It's about doing deals. It's about an element of hard power. It's about finding incentives for locking states into cooperative relations with the EU, and it is less about simply replicating or exporting the EU's own model. That all may seem very technical to you, but it's a fundamental kind of change in mindset in the way that the EU engages outwards with the world. Any other question on, yeah? One at the back.
My name is Kirill, I'm from Russia, and first of all I would like to thank you for your lecture, and my question regards the tensions between Russia and EU. Could you dwell on a bit on the current situation in bilateral relations, and from your point of view, what is the future of the crisis? So could the European Union lift its sanctions? Could the European Union accept Crimea as a part of Russian territory and so on? And could you switch on the slide about, and explain it a bit? So.
This is going to be my next slide about Russia. You all know relations between the EU and Russia are not good at the moment. They're probably as bad as they have ever been. Probably slightly better between Italy and Russia than between the UK and Russia, but in general the situation is not good. But in a way, the situation in Ukraine, I would say, has been a kind of half success of European foreign policy over the last 5 years. In 2013, when the Ukraine conflict broke out, many people predicted that Russia's actions would undermine the whole basis of European security order. That has not happened. On many issues, the EU and Russia still have more or less a working relationship. On energy, on climate issues, on some Middle Eastern issues, the EU and Russia do still talk together. On Ukraine, I would say it's more or less a kind of draw between the EU and Russia. Russia is still there. Russia today has much more influence in all the Eastern Partnership countries, Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, Georgia. That was the case before 2013. It is still the dominant power in Belarus, where the EU has very limited degree of influence. So in a way the crisis has revealed the limits to Russian power, and it's made Russia a kind of significant player in the region again. And to some extent the EU has recognized that this is the case. Before the crisis, the EU was designing its Eastern policy, what it calls the Eastern Partnership, without taking into consideration Russia at all. That is no longer the case. So the EU recognizes today that Russia has to be part of the equation, but still refuses to accept the Russian line that the Eastern countries is some kind of automatic sphere of influence for Russian foreign policy. So the crisis in Ukraine has revealed the limitations of European power, but also revealed the limitations of Russian power as well. Neither power has been able to definitively resolve the situation. Russia will keep control of Crimea. There's no realistic proposition of the EU or the US engaging strongly enough to get Russia out of Crimea. Russia is in the east of Ukraine. It's likely to stay present in the east of Ukraine. There is a very uneasy peace process there. It's only just holding. People are dying every day in Ukraine. Soldiers are being killed on the front line in eastern Ukraine. But it's a kind of low-level conflict. It's a very uneasy conflict, but it has not become a major conflict that affects the whole European security order, as many people predicted would be the case. So in that sense, things have not turned out as badly. This is very tragic for Ukraine, but it's not become a major systemic threat, as some people thought would be the case. I think the sanctions on Russia, the EU sanctions on Russia, are likely to stay unless Russia agrees to a deeper commitment to the peace. Do you all know the peace process that exists? It's called the Minsk peace process. So this is only just holding. It's very, very fragile. And Russia's commitment to that is still in doubt. In fact, as there is still doubt about Ukraine's commitment to that peace process as well. So there are increasing difficulties with the Ukrainian government as well. So the whole situation is very, very uneasy. The way I would describe it is that the EU has helped contain the conflict between the Ukraine and Russia, but it is not a conflict that is solved, and it will probably get worse before it gets better in the future. People in the EU realise this. Their desire of most people in the EU is to move back to some form of strategic partnership with Russia. But for that to happen, the European line, probably you would disagree on this, but the European line is that Russia at least needs to recognise that there are some red lines beyond which it cannot go in its own kind of external challenges to European interests. It's a very complex conflict I've kind of reduced to 1 minute there, but that's more or less what's happening in the East.
We have 3 minutes.
My name is Dmitry, I'm also from Russia, and I have a question concerning, you said about threat coming from rising powers such as Russia and China, but could you accept the idea that such a great level of dependence of European companies on the United States hinders the development of the EU even more than such threats coming from these rising powers? Because, for instance, many citizens in European countries I spoke with, and even some officials say that nowadays it's necessary and it's essential to build new, more strategic relations with Russia, and in some cases, and actually Iranian case shows that in some issues the opinions of European officials and citizens do not coincide with that of the United States.
I think that's a fair enough assessment. I still think, I appreciate you a row of you here won't agree with me, but Russia represents a systemic threat to global order, and the EU needs to deal with that, and that there are fundamental disagreements there. But the worrying drift in US policy means that on some policy issues today, the EU is more in alignment with Russia and with China than it is with the United States. Iran is one example, it's not the only example. There may be some alignment on Syria has been a big difference between the EU and Russia, but in the future there may be some kind of pragmatic cooperation between some European governments and Russia over Middle Eastern issues once it's recognised that the Assad regime has basically won the conflict, unfortunately, in Syria, and is there to stay. There may be some kind of pragmatic working relationship, and indeed in general on energy issues there's more or less pragmatic cooperation with Russia. So it depends on the policy areas, on trade issues as well. There it's more Russia and the United States against the EU sometimes. So on some issues it's more Russia and the US cooperating against other powers. And so I think my concluding thought on this would be that there's such a great degree of change and fluidity in the world order at the moment. So you should go away from this lecture realizing that there's so much changing in the global order at the moment that what we thought were fairly fixed sets of alliances today are changing, and the EU is kind of struggling to reposition itself in that emerging or that very changing nature of the global order. It's trying to influence things, it's trying to protect the existing liberal order, but one challenge it has is not only does the US at the moment seem to be committed to undermining that very order, but other powers around the world don't necessarily see the EU's own understanding of liberal order as being particularly liberal. So if the EU is to defend this global order, it will need partnerships with new powers and have to accept that they understand liberal order in a slightly different way than the EU has traditionally understood that term.
Okay, so our time is over, and so thank you very much, Richard, for this excellent lecture.